So yesterday I went down to Citizens Bank, which now is at the Giant Eagle, in case you guys are wondering, and went to the Citizens Bank, and I went up to the teller, who was actually somebody from our church, and I said, I need $100 in ones. And this is why. I brought it with me to church today. This is what $100 in ones looks like. You're like, I thought it'd be more impressive. It's really not that impressive, but I brought $100 in ones with me today, and if you all would look under your chairs as well, there's nothing under there, so I don't have that kind of money. This is my own money right here. But today what we want to talk about is, what would Jesus do with $100? How would he budget $100 of his own money? What would that look like? Because here's what I believe. If you can get $100 right, you can get $1,000 or you can get $100,000 right. Because how you act with $100, what your relationship is with just 100 is what your relationship is going to be with 1,000 or 100,000 or more. And so we're going to talk about this today. So keep your eye on that. Make sure that doesn't go anywhere. But we're going to talk about this as we continue our series, Every Square Inch. And this series is inspired by a quote from a 19th century Dutch theologian named Abraham Kuyper. And there's this quote that you're probably going to have memorized by the end of the year. He says, there's not a square inch in the whole domain of existence over which Christ, who is Lord over all, does not exclaim, mine. And what this series is all about is that Jesus is Lord over every areas of our lives, not just Sundays, not just some of our lives, but every square inch of our lives. And so last week we talked about what that means for every minute of our lives and how to redeem the time and time management according to the Bible. But this week we're going to talk about every dollar, and we're going to think a lot about finances. And so each week we've been editing this quote from Abraham Kuyper and thinking about a different area of our lives. And this week, this is how we're editing it. It says, there's not a single dollar. Everybody say single dollar. There's not a single dollar or crypto or yen or whatever in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, who is Lord over all, does not exclaim, mine. And so it all belongs to Jesus. And we're going to talk about what that means today. And I know that in a room of this size, there are some of you who are struggling this month to feel like you've got enough to pay the bills. And so you're in here, and you're like, here we are talking about money, and you're just thinking, I don't even know how I'm going to pay rent this month, or I don't know how I'm going to keep the lights on, or make sure that we got enough groceries this month. And so you're thinking about that this month. There are others of you who have more money than you know what to do with, and you're wondering, what do I do with all of this? And some of you are like, I wish that was the situation I was in this morning. And some of you, you just feel like the church always talks about money. Like maybe you have a rough experience with that, where it just felt like you were at a church that was always talking about money. Or maybe you're somebody in this room who's exploring faith, and you're showing up at this church for the first time, and you're like, oh boy, of all the things, right, they're talking about money. This is fulfilling all my deeply held suspicions about church, and we're talking about money. And so today, we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to explore why Jesus talked so much about money, because he talked about it more than you might realize. We're going to talk about how Jesus might budget $100, and think about that a little bit today with these 3 jars up here. And then finally, I'm going to give you an invitation that you got actually on your way in the door this morning of what it could look like to leverage some of your money to leave a generational impact through our church. So if you have a Bible this morning, open up to Matthew chapter 6, 19 through 24. That's in the New Testament. If you've never opened the Bible before, there's a table of contents in the front, Old Testament and New Testament in that table of contents, and Matthew is in the New Testament. It's the first book of the New Testament. We're in the Matthew chapter 6, which is at the heart of something called the Sermon on the Mount, a brilliant set of teaching that summarizes the teaching of Jesus in so many different ways. And so right at the heart of it, listen to what Jesus says to those who are listening and to those of us in this room. Matthew chapter 6, 19 through 24 says, don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. So if the light within you is darkness, how deep is that darkness? No one can serve 2 masters, since either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Again, I know that in this room, there's some of you who are thinking, man, it just feels like the church is always talking about money. Not just the church, everybody. It's just money's on everybody's topic, on everybody's mind, but especially in the church. And I wanted you to know that I get it. right? I understand what that's like. It's one of the reasons why I often shy away from talking about money. Sometimes I don't talk about it as much as maybe we should, in part because what I'm thinking about is I'm thinking about those of you who maybe have a bad experience with that, or those of you who are exploring faith for the first time, and I don't want you to think that this is all we ever talk about all the time, and I'm always thinking, it's somebody's first week in our church, and here we are talking about money. I also know that some churches have misused finances. Some churches have been manipulative about money, and it makes the rest of us look bad. I'm just telling you right now, I don't have a private jet. I don't know what I would do with one if I had one. I'm sure I'd figure it out. But man, I don't have one, and I don't know what I do with one. But there are churches that's a big part of their budget, somehow to figure that one out. And so at the same time, if it feels like the church talks a lot about money, one of the things that you might realize or might not realize is that Jesus actually talked even more about money sometimes than the church does. Howard Dayton, in his book, one of the books I'm going to recommend, author of a book called Your Money Counts, he says this. He says 16 of the 38 parables were concerned with how to handle money and possessions. So parables were Jesus' teaching stories that he told. In fact, Jesus Christ said more about money than about almost any other subject. The Bible offers 500 verses on prayer, fewer than 500 verses on faith, but more than 2,350 verses on money and possessions. And so some of you are reading through the Bible this year, and as you're reading through the Bible, you discover a couple of things. One, you'll be like, this seems to talk a lot about blood. Why is blood talked about all the time? But then you also discover at some point that it talks a lot about money. And as you go from the beginning to the end of the Bible, you'll notice a lot of verses and a lot of passages and stories that are related to money and possessions. And so if the church talks a lot about money, the first thing is to realize that actually Jesus talked a lot about money. And what we have to ask ourselves is, why does Jesus have so much to say about money? Is it just because he needs it? Does he want it? Why does Jesus talk so much about money? The answer, one of the places that the answer is buried, is right here within the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount, for those of you who aren't familiar, is 3 chapters of a summary of brilliant teaching from Jesus. And basically everything that he had, the main things that he had to say about how to access and the life that you're made for and what it's all about. But right at the middle of it, in the middle chapter, in chapter 6, Jesus starts talking about money. Because there's a relationship between money and the life that you're made for, but it's often not what you think. And so one of the things that's been true about humans, and I always look for this when I'm reading the Bible, like what's true then, what's true now as well, that we can look at from the beginning to now, is from the first century until now, there's a human tendency in all of our hearts to think that I am Lord of my money and possessions. Like, this is my money. I got out of the bank yesterday. It's easy to think like I earned this, or however we got this, like it's mine because it's in my possession. We literally call it a possession, or it's something that I own. And so often maybe you never said it this way, but we think of ourselves to say that I'm Lord of my money. Like, this is my human right. This money belongs to me. And often, even as believers, to borrow an illustration from Howard Dayton, it's like when you get baptized. We're going to do baptisms here on Easter. But imagine somebody's getting baptized. They're like, I believe Jesus is the Lord, the Savior, all that kind of stuff. And he's like, but wait, let me take my money out, and I'm going to hold it out of the baptistry as I'm going down, just to make sure that that part stays mine, right? Because often we're okay with Jesus being Lord of every area of our life. But this, and often sex, that's off limits from God. We don't want him to touch those two things. And so we keep our money separate and say, Jesus, you can be Lord of everything except my dollars. I'm going to keep those over here, and I'm not going to give you access to my bank account. You're not going to know my password, whatever it is. And so often we try to remain Lord of our money. But when you read what Jesus says about money and about his lordship, what you'll find is that he doesn't really leave that as an option. Listen to how he describes reality. He says this. He says, no one can serve two masters. So we're in Matthew 6, verse 24. Since he will either hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Notice he doesn't say 3 masters. He says 2 masters here. And he says, at the end of the day, when it comes to money, there are really only 2 options. Jesus will be Lord of your money, or your money will be Lord of you. There's nothing in between. There's no like, well, no, Jesus is my Lord, and then I'm Lord of my money. Like, that's not how it works. Jesus will be Lord of your money, or your money will be Lord of you. And they lead to 2 totally different outcomes in your life. And Paul describes this in a letter that he was writing to a church in Ephesus, but writing through his protege, Timothy. But if money is Lord, you're going to be constantly worried about it. You're never going to be at peace. In fact, right after this section in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus follows it up by talking about not worrying. Why does he follow it up by talking about not worrying? Because he just talked about money. And if money is your Lord, you're going to constantly be worried about things. You're never going to be at peace. Whether you have a little bit of money or a lot of money, it's never going to be enough, and you can't put your hope in it because one bad year can just wipe it all out. And so this is why Paul writes, and he's writing to this through Timothy, how to instruct this church in Ephesus, where there are a lot of wealthy folks in this church. And he says this in 1 Timothy 6, 8 through 10, but those who want to be rich fall into temptation, a trap, and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge people into ruin and destruction. Notice, doesn't plunge people into life, in abundant life, and more of the life they're made for, but ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, and by craving it, some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. He's saying that money, rather than leading toward the life you're made for, if you get your relationship with money wrong, it'll actually lead you away from the life that Jesus himself came to bring. But if Jesus is Lord of your money, he says next in Matthew 6, you don't have to worry because you know that God will provide what you need. He has your cares in mind. He knows your expenses each month. He frees you up to be generous. And that's why Christians have been some of the most generous people throughout history. And it's why Paul can write this at the end of 1 Timothy chapter 6 in verses 17 through 19. He says this, instruct those, so he's saying, Timothy, instruct those who are rich in the present age. And some of you are like, yeah, those wealthy people in the room need to hear this. That's all of us, by the way. Like, just letting you know, just comparatively to the world, we are an incredibly rich group of people. And you might not think that, and might not feel that way when you compare yourself to the person sitting next to you, but that's us in this text. It's not just some people in this room. Instruct those who are rich in the present age, not to be arrogant or to set their hope on the uncertainty of wealth, but on God, who richly provides us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do what is good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and willing to share, storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of what is truly life. Notice what he says here. He says he's giving all this stuff about money, not because, he doesn't even say it's because God needs it or any of that. He's saying why? So that you can take hold of that which is truly life. He's saying as long as you're holding money tightly, you don't have a free hand to take hold of that which is truly life. We're trying to hold on to this and hold on to life, but as soon as you loosen your grip on money, you're free to take hold of the life that you're made for in a new way. Jesus famously told us in a story about a rich young ruler, or not told this, but there's an episode where Jesus encounters a rich young ruler who comes to him and he says, Jesus, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, did you keep all the commandments? He's like, yeah, I've been doing that since I was a kid. He's like, all right, go and sell all your possessions. And the young man walks away sad. Why does he walk away sad? Because he realized that in order to take hold of life, he was going to have to loosen his grip on his possessions. Because at the end of the day, Jesus will be Lord of your money, or your money will be Lord of you. And one of those relationships will lead to life, and the other will lead toward ruin and destruction. And so why does Jesus in the church talk so much about money? It's not because Jesus needs your money. He does not need your money. He's got the cattle on 1,000 hills, whatever. That's a good thing in the Old Testament, by the way. And it's because he knows that you cannot fully take hold of the life you're made for until we loosen our grip on money. Money is one of those things in our lives that becomes an obstacle to sometimes fully experiencing the life that Jesus has for you. But if Jesus is Lord of your money, it changes everything about your relationship with money. Listen to what Larry Burkett says, again, in the book from Howard Dayton about Your Money Counts. He says, when we acknowledge God's ownership, every spending decision becomes a spiritual decision. No longer do we ask, Lord, what do you want me to do with my money? Which is so often, that sounds like a very spiritual question, but you're on the way. But this is where it actually is supposed to be. The question is restated, Lord, what do you want me to do with your money? So if it's true, if every dollar, including these $100 right here, belonged to Jesus, what could it look like to live as if every dollar belongs to Jesus? It's going to be the most basic advice you've ever heard, but it starts with making a budget. And I don't have a verse to support that. I'm just telling you right now. In fact, I'm going to tell you right now that Jesus probably did not have a budget. I don't think he kept a spreadsheet of it. I don't think he kept it on papyrus. I don't think he had an app for budgeting. I don't know how Jesus would have budgeted, but here's what I want to say, is that all the financial wisdom in the world says that if you want to be intentional about how you use your money, and as Christians, we're supposed to be more intentional than anyone else, one of the best tools available to you is a budget to make sure that your income and your expenses are both matching and that your money is going in the right direction. And so what's a budget? Let's talk about a budget for just a minute. A budget is a tool for prayerfully prioritizing how Jesus wants you to use his money. Most financial wisdom would say if you want to get wise about finances, you're probably going to want to build a budget so you know where your money is going and making sure it's going toward the right things. But what Jesus would change about that is that it's not just about you thinking about how to spend your money. It's you thinking about how am I going to prioritize Jesus' money that he has entrusted to me toward the things that it's supposed to go toward. And so a budget is a tool for prayerfully prioritizing, I'll put this in pencil, how Jesus wants you to use his money. And so Jesus has a lot of parables that make a point that basically says you, according to Jesus, you are Jesus's financial manager. And so what that means is Jesus has entrusted each of us with money that he wants us to manage and use according to his purposes, because it's not our money. We are simply managing his money. Dave Ramsey, who some people love, some people hate, and most people don't care, says this about a budget. He says that the goal of a budget is to assign every single dollar a name on purpose before the month begins. And when you know where your money is going, you have control over it instead of it controlling you. And so from a young age, my dad taught me how to make a budget. Very fun times in the Goen household as a child. Julie primarily makes ours now. But if you're just getting started, it can feel a little bit overwhelming to think about budgeting. And some of you are thinking, like, if I wanted to wake up early, get to church, and look all pretty, and learn about budgets, I would have stayed home, right? I would have gone to a community college course rather than hear my pastor talk to me about budgets this morning. And so there are so many different ways to break down a budget. But the single best framework that I've come across for thinking about your budget is one of the simplest. And it comes from a guy named Ron Lieber. He's a New York Times journalist, writes a lot about money. He's author of a book called The Opposite of Spoiled. And he says it's helpful to think about your budget in 3 categories. Here they are: give, save, and spend. Everybody say give, save, spend. And so some of you are like, that's way too basic. Mine has about 1 billion subcategories. I get it. Whatever works for you. But this is for the rest of us, okay? Give, save, and spend. And so with the budget, this is going to be just common sense here, but you start with your average monthly income or what your expected monthly income is, and then at the end, you want your expenses or what you put in these jars to match that. So that's the assumption we're starting with. But then he says you want to divide your spending or your total use of your money into 3 categories: give, save, and spend. So let's walk through these for a moment. Let's start with give. And so we have our give jar right here. And we're going to start with give because so often we start over here with spend. And we think about all the things that I need to spend money on in a given month. You think about your house insurance and your health insurance. You think about your rent or your mortgage, any number of things that your Netflix account, your Spotify account, whatever things that you have over here that are in the spend. And then at the end of the day, you're like, okay, I got $1 left. Which one of these am I going to put it toward? Am I going to save it? Am I going to give it away? But often we've to start here, and then we've got nothing left over here. So we're going to flip it and start over here. And at the end of the day, you might need to adjust this, but that will give you a sense of maybe what goals to pursue over here. So we're going to start over here with give, because generosity, when what Jesus has to say about generosity is one of the single best habits for breaking the grip of money in your life. Because when you are being generous, what you are literally doing is you're taking these things out of your hand and you're giving them to someone else. And it's opening your hands to receive and to experience that which is truly life. Every time you give your money away, you are saying to your money, you are not Lord of me. Jesus is. Every time you give your money away, that's what's happening. Listen to what Paul writes about generosity to a rich church in Corinth. He writes this, and he's trying to raise money, by the way, not just for himself and for his paycheck, or he's not just trying to raise money for the church. He's raising money for a famine relief fund. I always say it's like he's doing a GoFundMe for a church in Jerusalem that's about to go through a famine. He's like, let's help them out, guys. Macedonia already helped out. I want you guys to help. And this is what he writes in 2 Corinthians 9. The point is this: the person who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the person who sows generously will also reap generously. Each person should do as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or out of compulsion, since God loves a cheerful giver, and God is able to make every grace overflow to you, so that in every way, always having everything you need, you may excel in every good work. So he's writing to them, and if you read all around this in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, you get a whole theology of what does it look like to be generous. But what could it look like? What does generosity look like? There's a lot of different ways we could think about it. And in our Everyday Habits course through Everyday Institute, we talk about 3 different ways to be generous. And we call it your generosity portfolio. And some people have an investment portfolio. Some people are like, don't even know what that is, never thought about it. I don't have one. But all of us should have a generosity portfolio. And a generosity portfolio includes 3 primary areas. So when you think about what can you give toward, 3 primary areas you can think about. One is your church. And so our church always has a budget every year, and that budget doesn't just come out of nowhere. It comes from people like you who give toward that budget and help us make disciples through our church in all kinds of different ways. And I'm going to share more about that in just a little bit. But then you also have your community. And your community is people that God has placed in your life who have needs that arise every once in a while, and he has put you in their life to help meet that need. But if you have never set anything aside to give, you are not in a position to really help them as those opportunities arise. But if you start paying attention, you will have moments where you look around you in your life where you have people who are in need, who you know, and God has said, man, don't just pray for them, but actually be an answer to prayer and provide generously for that person in your life. Rosaria Butterfield, in her book, The Gospel Comes at the House Key, that this says this might even include hospitality. That some of you want to have more people in your home. You want to feed more people. Guess what? Feeding people costs money, but you could put that over here and give, because it's just going to cost you more to make room at your table, to have people over, and to be a place where people can come and get a good meal and just a warm house. And then finally, there's your charities or your causes. And so you're going to have organizations that matter to you, organizations that are moving the mission of Jesus forward alongside of the church. And rather than supporting 1,000 charities, one of the things that we encourage in our church is be less but better. And so find a couple of charities that you go big on in your life, a couple of partners that you really invest in, like Urban Impact Foundation or so many of the other partners that we partner with as a church. And so if you actually need some trusted partners, on our website, you can go to bellevuechristian.church/partnerships. You see a whole list of who we partner with. We actually give away about $30,000 every year just from our budget to go to different partners to help supply their needs as they move the mission of Jesus forward. So just tell a story about generosity real quick. Last week, we went down to the Strip District with our kids to get some cool stuff. And so it was a Steelers weekend, and we're like, we need to go to the Strip District and get some fresh Steelers stuff. So we went down, and my kids were like, can we bring our wallets? You know, we're like, sure. And we know that they're going to spend it on junk. But they're like, can we bring our wallets? And we're like, yep, you can bring them. But then one of our kids said to Julie, like, would it be okay if I see somebody that's homeless, can I give them some money? And we're like, no. We are raising them right. Look at us. We're such good parents. And then, so we get there. First thing they do is they spend most of their money on T-shirts. And so they each get a T-shirt for themselves, they're fine. That's cool. And then we're walking around, and one of them sees somebody holding a sign saying that they're homeless and looking for some money. And my wife leans to one of the kids that asked about that, like, hey, this is your opportunity. Do you want to give to this? And they said, not right now. And they just kept on walking. And you know what? The heart was there, though. The heart was there. So not totally there yet. And I think it had more to do with shyness than stinginess. But nonetheless, the heart was there. But that's where it starts. It starts with giving. Second jar is saving. Saving. And that might take the form of wise investing. Saving takes a lot of different forms. But again, often what happens is we make this second after spending. So we start over here at spend, and then if we got anything left, we do save, and then we're like, oh man, I'm supposed to give, and then we think maybe about giving as well, but often we start over here. But if you start over here, and then you think about this, you're gonna be in a better position to think about this as well. And so the second category is saving. And some of you might be wondering, Austin, is it even biblical to save money? Like often, once a year, you're going to hear me tell a story about a guy named George Mueller, this guy who started orphanages in England, in Bristol, England, and he basically just prayed and God provided everything for him. It stirs my heart every time. And you're like, remember that George Mueller story? Like, he didn't seem like he saved anything. He just prayed and God provided. Or like right after this in Matthew 6, Jesus says, don't worry about tomorrow. You know, is saving really a biblical practice? And I'm going to be honest, I've thought about this week. Like, is saving just like worldly wisdom, or is it actually biblical wisdom as well? And here's what I found, is that there's a big difference between saving and hoarding. Saving is biblical, as best as I can understand. Hoarding is not. And I think you hear the difference in this parable that Jesus tells. Listen to what he says here. He says, he then told them, watch out and be on guard against all greed, because one's life is not in the abundance of possessions. So like, this is general principle of Jesus. He teaches this all the time. It says, then he told them a parable. Rich man's land is very productive. He thought to himself, what should I do? Since I don't have anywhere to store my crops, I will do this, he said. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones and store all my grain and my goods there. Everybody say all. So all is a key word here. Store all my grain and my goods there. And then he says, I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take it easy, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. And he goes on to say this, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? That's how it is with the one who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Now, there's one way of reading that parable and reading it to say, see, Jesus says don't save. Saving's bad. That's not exactly what's going on there. The problem is not that he had barns to save some of his stuff. Like there's a reason that he's saving some of it, either to sell as part of his business, or maybe he's saving it up for the winter months, like whatever it is. The problem is not that he was saving some of his stuff in barns. The problem was that he wanted to tear down his barns and build bigger barns so that he could save all of his money and all of his goods, and that could be it. And so the problem isn't with saving, according to the Bible. The problem is with hoarding, when you're keeping back something that God actually wants you to bless somebody else with. And so when it comes to biblical saving, it's helpful to have some saving goals, because if you have goals or a reason for saving rather than just keeping it all to yourself, it'll help you avoid what's called hoarding. And so a couple things that you might have as saving goals. One is simply saving for emergencies. The Financial Peace University course calls this saving for an emergency fund. And I remember this is one of the first steps in that course. Julie and I took that course probably a decade ago now, and it really helped us realize that we needed to save up, that we had no rainy day fund for this kind of stuff. And so if you take anything from that section, maybe just take that. Some of you might be saving up for a house down payment. Like, you have to be able to put up a little bit up front. And Julie and I had to figure out how to do that after we paid off college debt. We saved up for that for a while. Now Julie and I were in our late 30s, and we're like, man, retirement's just around the corner. And so we're thinking about it, right? We're 36 and 37 now. We're halfway there. And some say as much as 15% of your household income. There's a lot of ways to think about retirement, but Julie and I are starting to realize we need to save for that too. But there are other things to save for, like a fun family trip, or you realize your vehicle is dying. You're going to need a better vehicle, or an anniversary trip, or a personal adventure, or even just an inheritance for your children's children, as the Psalms talk about. A lot of things that you can save for without hoarding. Third category then is spend. And that's what the rest of the money that God has given to you is for. And there is so much stuff to spend money on it. And one of the things I found out as an adult is that most of it is not fun. For example, I remember when I was a kid and I was thinking, man, when I get those big boy paychecks and I'm just like really an adult and I have money, two things I'm going to get. I'm going to get a Gibson SG Standard electric guitar, and I'm going to get a trampoline. Those are the two things that I said, when I got money, I'm going to get those two things. Let me tell you, I have paychecks now, and I don't have either of those two things. And every time I walk by a trampoline and Sam's Club, I think today is not the day, every time. And so here's the thing, though. When it comes to spending, there are definitely some priorities with spending. And the priorities might look like this: needs, debts, and wants. First of all, there's needs. Sometimes you think something's a need, but it's not actually a need, it's more of a want. You have these moments where you realize that you've become your parents. I'm having those moments a lot right now where my children would say, I need that. I'm like, do you need it? That's such a debt. Like my dad would ask that question, do you need it? No, I don't need it. I want it. Okay, let's have clarity. And no, you can't have it. And then, but there's a lot of needs, right? There's groceries, clothing, healthcare, utilities, transportation. Paul keeps it really simple. He says this: if we have food and clothing, we're going to be content with these. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 8. I might expand it a little bit, but that's what Paul said. Food and clothing, that's all you need. Second, though, is debts. So if you're a young adult in the room, good chance you've got student debt. And maybe you're thinking about that right now, and you're like, I don't know how and when we're going to get out of that. Some of you have a mortgage, some with better interest rates than others, and you know that that's debt, sometimes debt that in many ways is unavoidable in the modern world. So you make a down payment on a house, but then you're paying off your mortgage for a while. Some of you have credit card debt from choices that you wish you didn't make, and now you can't figure out a way out of it. And one of the most helpful ideas that we got from the Financial Peace University course, and we took it about a decade ago, was the idea of a debt snowball. And what that means is that you start by always paying off your monthly payment on your debt, but then as you're able to, from saving money and from reducing your expenses on needs and things like that and wants, using as much as you can to then pay off the principal on top of that each month. So not just doing the minimum payments, but trying to pay more so it pays off the principal, not just the interest. And so that was really helpful for us as well. Just as a side note here, for those of you who are thinking about buying a house, just because the bank says that you can afford a house doesn't mean you should. And so just make sure that you're talking with God about what is the right amount to spend on a house. So the bank does not care about that, but God does. And there's often great reasons to move into a house, but just make sure that you're actually thinking about what makes sense for you. And then finally, there's wants. Dave Ramsey loyalists would say that you can't have anything you want ever until you're like 90 years old. And then after you pay off all your debts and budget appropriately and figure it all out, then you can have fun when you're 95. Here's the thing. There are good things that God has given us to enjoy. And you will have a very sad life if you never spend your money on things to simply enjoy with just yourself or with other people as well. And so there are wants that you don't always have to feel bad about, just alongside of prayerful prioritization of giving, saving, and spending. So let's go back to our $100. Ben Urbanik, you want to come up here? I'm going to have him. A round of applause for Ben. He's going to be my... Here, why don't you stand over here on this side, Ben? All right, Ben, I'm going to give you $100. I'm going to ask for it back, okay? So just don't get too excited. I want you to turn to face them for a minute. So we got these 3 jars here. And so these $100, they represent 100% of your income, all right? So you can think of each dollar as representing 1%. So whatever your income is, you can just think of it right here through these $100. And so I'm Jesus in this situation. I have given you my $100 that I got out from Citizens Bank yesterday. And I want us to think and discern together, prayerfully prioritize how we want to budget this across giving, saving, and spending. And so let's start with giving. I want you to give somewhere between 1 and 10%. What do you feel like? So $1 and $10. How much do you want to put in the give jar?
Probably
7. Any reasons?
Because I think give is one of the more important ones.
There we go. He's doing it right, guys. I didn't even train him in that. So you can put, why don't you put $7 in the give jar, all right? There you go. Good job. We'll get that in there somehow. There we go. Great. So we started with give. And again, the Bible doesn't, it says in the Old Testament 10% is a tithe, but in the New Testament, it doesn't really give that hard and fast rule. But 10% is a great place to start, but I'm not a legalist about it because I don't think the Bible is. And so if you're like, I can't start with 10%, I can start with 1%. Start with 1% and see what happens from there and just grow year after year after year and how much you give away. All right, let's talk about save. Let's do between 5 and 15%. First of all, is there anything that you're saving for right now in this season of your life? Anything you want real bad? His family's smiling.
An Xbox?
He wants an Xbox, people. So why don't you put some money in the save jar for that Xbox in retirement? Between $5 and $15. How much do you want to save?
15, because if I save, then I'll have more for giving and like more for what I want.
Makes sense to me. All right, so why don't you count off 15 and you can put it right in there. Awesome. So we're going to put 15 now in there. So how much do we put in give again? I can't remember. 7. We put 15 in there. So our math now is 22 that we've put between giving and saving. And then the rest, which is 78, that's going to go now and spend. So I'm going to put this over here and spend for you. And now you've divided it up. You basically budgeted your money. Round of applause for Ben Urbanik. Good job, dude. Appreciate you, dude. And so obviously, like, this is, we're set up here, right? But here's the thing. You might need to adjust. You might get down here and you're like, oh, I'm going to need health insurance. So I'm going to move a little bit, from here over to get some health insurance or something like that. And so it's not a hard and fast, but starting over here and working this way rather than starting here and working this way can help you begin to set some vision for these areas of your life. And so try it yourself this month. You might use a spreadsheet, pen and paper, literal jars. My wife and I use an app called Every Dollar that's helpful for us. But listen to what Jesus says in Luke about this. He says, whoever is faithful in very little, we can just think of that as $100. Whoever is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. But whoever is unrighteous or unfaithful in very little is also unrighteous or unfaithful in much. Luke chapter 16, verse 10. And there's a prosperity gospel way of misreading this that says, like, well, if you're faithful with a little bit, God's going to give you more. He's just going to keep showering money on your life. And I don't necessarily think that's how it works. I think what Jesus is saying here is a principle. And the principle is this: how you spend $100 is how you spend 1,000. And how you budget $100 is how you budget 1,000. And so thinking about it that way, if you're faithful in a little, you'll be faithful in much, whether or not that grows or not over the course of your life. I love how John Wesley summarized this in a sermon from the 1700s. And my neighbors have a version of this on the wall in their kitchen, and I love looking at it. He says, gain all you can without hurting either yourself or your neighbor in soul or body by applying hereto with unintermitted diligence and with all understanding which God has given you. Save all you can by cutting off every expense which serves only to indulge foolish desire. Waste nothing, living or dying, on sin or folly, whether for yourself or your children, and then give all you can. In other words, give all you have to God. Just a word to the wealthy in the room. One of the things I loved about John Wesley is one of the things he decided at some point in his life was not like, I'm going to give 10% or whatever. At some point in his life, he says, I'm going to live on this amount over here. And he said, this is how much we need as a family to live. Everything beyond that, we're going to give away. And so no matter how much his income changed over the course of his life, he said, this is how much we need to live. Everything else, we're going to give away. And one of the things that you see throughout the history of the church is whenever you see a great move of God or a great organization or a great person who did great things for God, often behind the scenes, you will find what some have called gospel patrons, people that God, are people who are wealthy for whatever reason, who have used their finances instead of for themselves, but to bless the things where they see God moving in the world. And so you might be a part of stories like that in your life. And so start paying attention to how God might want to use that. Quick word to teenagers is start this when you're young. Don't wait until you're old and you have big boy and big girls paychecks. Just start now. I remember where I was a dishwasher at Luigi's Pizzeria down the street. I have no idea what I spent that money on. And when I was 16 years old, probably I did not spend it on a trampoline or a Gibson SG Standard. But figure out for yourself how to apply this even now when you're a teenager. And a word to parents is don't wait until your children leave the home to have your first conversation with them about money. The worst thing that can happen is a kid gets to 22 years old and they're out on their own and they have to make thousands of financial decisions and no one has ever once talked to them about how to do this wisely and in light of Jesus. And so my encouragement to you is that while your children are still in your home, is to include them in conversations about money. Include them in your conversations about how do you give to church and different organizations. Include them in conversations about how you spend. Ron Lieber at one point in his book said a dad took all the money that their family made each month and they printed it all, or they had it all in dollar bills. And they showed the kids where all the money goes to each month and how they do that, just to walk them through this. Because again, I think as parents, sometimes you can think a lot about how to have the sex talk with your kids, but never how to have the money talk. And like the sex talk, it's not meant to just be a one-time conversation. It's meant to be a lot of conversations in the context of real life over their entire adolescence. And so that said, here are some books that might help you if you want to grow in this area. One are resources as well. One is called Your Money Counts. And this is basically everything the Bible has to say about money summed up really nicely. Just a good biblical theology of money from Howard Dayton. Another one is a super practical course that you might not always agree with exactly the wisdom in this course, but it's really helpful for getting started and thinking about money, called Financial Peace University. Our friends at Redeemer are running it right now down the street. We'll probably run it again in the future, but you can always take it online. And then a third is a book. It's not a Christian book, but it's a book called The Opposite of Spoiled. Super helpful for thinking about how to apply biblical wisdom to how I think about raising our kids when it comes to money. And so if you're going to live like every dollar belongs to Jesus, wisdom says that one great place to start is by making a budget and prayerfully prioritizing how you will spend and use Jesus' money. And if you're wondering where to start with a budget, don't make it overcomplicated. Start right here with give, save, and spend. Instead of with spend, start with give and work your way this way. So as you're discerning this year about how you want to use Jesus' money, I want to give you an invitation. And this is an invitation. It's not a compulsion, which is what 2 Corinthians says, not giving out a compulsion. Simply an invitation. If you want to be generous with your money this year and loosen its hold on your life, here's one way that you can do it. On your way in today, you got a handout for something called our Every Square Inch campaign. It looks like this. You can grab one on your way out if you didn't grab one. And we're going to talk more about this in 2 weeks on Vision Sunday, where we're going to give you more about what Every Square Inch is all about. But the big thing is it's primarily about optimizing the lower level of our church, both our kids ministry, reimagining the floor plan for that, but then also updating our bathrooms as well. And so there's a whole letter on the website. If you go to this link or you scan that QR code, you can read more about the reasoning behind this. But we'll share more in 2 weeks as well. But what we're inviting you to do this year is to expand your generosity and help make a generational impact through our church. And again, this is an invitation. And so when you think about our budget, which is being voted on today by our members, we apply these same principles that I just talked about to the development of our church budget. And our 2026 budget is $526,269. But that's two things. One is our operating budget, which is $396,000, and then the other is $130,000, which is helping cover at the first phase of Every Square Inch in renovating the lower level of our church. And you might be wondering, where did the number $130K come from? One, it's kind of a ballpark estimate that will get us in the door of what we're trying to do. But two is it came out of prayer. We were downstairs praying as a council in the basement. And some of you know that the basement got flooded late last year. And here's the good news. 18 months ago, we had discerned that we wanted to invest in this building anyways, and that just moved it forward. And so we were down there praying in the basement that had been wet and was torn up. And we were asking the Lord, how much? And the number that kept coming to mind was $130,000. And the reason is because this year is actually the 130th anniversary of our church. For 130 years, people have been giving generously, some of whom have sat in the same pews as you, at least since the 1960s. Then before that, all the way back to 1896, have been giving to move the mission of Jesus forward. And so what we're asking you to do this year is to expand your generosity. Instead of saying, give to this campaign over here, and then also give to our church operating budget, we just combined it all together and said, just give to our church, and that's going to help be toward our operating budget, but then also toward every square inch as well. And so we gave you these cards to help you figure out what that can look like this year on how to expand your generosity. And I'm going to walk you through just a sample of how to fill one out. So the first line up here is what we normally give to the church in a year. And for some of you, that number might be 0 because you've never given to our church before. And that's okay. Just write 0 there because everything you give will be expanding your generosity. But let's just start with $1,200, okay? And let's just imagine you give $100 a month toward our church. And so you'd write that there on the first line. And if you're not sure how much, you can either access it through the generosity page on Planning Center where you give on the giving page, or you'll probably get it in the next 2 weeks in the mail as well. And then the second thing is to think about, okay, then how do I want to expand our generosity? So keep giving what you gave last year, and then figure out how might the Lord be leading you to expand your generosity in the coming year to help fund phase 1 of every square inch. So let's say, for example, you want to have a couple less lattes this year and cancel your Netflix account, and that equals, let's say, $360, like $30 a month. And so you put that right here. That's how much you want to expand your generosity. Some of you, again, you didn't give anything last year, and that's okay. Maybe you're brand new to our church. Just write whatever you want to give this year and expanded generosity. And you have expanded your generosity this year and helped fund every square inch. And then there's one more section down there at the bottom for just one-time financial gifts. Some of you are like, I just gave a lot of gifts to everyone in my family, and I can't be making one-time financial gifts. But others of you maybe just came into some money for whatever reason, and you want to help us get started strong this year. That's what that is for. And then just add it all up and figure out what the total is, and that's your 1-year commitment to help us fund every square inch in the next year. But we're not asking you to do anything today about that. We're just asking you to pray about it. It's an invitation, really, to you to be a part of leaving a generational legacy through our church. And so we want you to spend the next 2 weeks between now and Vision Sunday simply praying about whether or not you can make a commitment to that, and then we'll have a box where you can drop off that commitment. And so we've asked for your name and email address, not so that I can be like a debt collector and go chase everybody down and that kind of thing, but it's simply so that, one, we can be praying for you this year that God provides for you, but also so that our treasurer can send you an email, she's the one who will see the numbers, not us, but she will see those numbers, and she can send you an email just saying, this is what your commitment was, and here's how to do that. Not to track you down, but to simply help empower you and pray for you. And so you might be thinking like financial campaigns. You just don't like that. It's not what you're into. I get it. And Julie and I have been invited into these over time as well. And even this past year, we were invited into one from another organization in our life. And we prayed about it, and we realized we didn't want to miss out on the opportunity to be a part of the legacy that was going to be left through that campaign. And we're going to be doing the same with this one. We're going to be praying over the next 2 weeks ourselves, our council, our leadership community. Everybody's praying about what are we going to give to help fund this in the next year. And this is just an invitation to you to be part of it. And so regardless of whether or not you're part of every square inch, or maybe you've already got something else that you're planning to be generous to, the question that all of us have to ask is this, will Jesus be Lord of your money, or will your money be Lord of you? And the reality is that all of us have let money rule over us at some point in our lives. All of us have let money at different points in our lives lead us to worry, has taken away our peace, has prevented us from accessing the life that we're made for in so many ways. But the good news is that Jesus, the Lord himself, the Bible says, God gave generously of himself and gave his life so that through faith in him, you might become rich. Not necessarily financially, which is what some prosperity preachers might say, but spiritually. And be free to live a generous life in which you can trust him as Lord of your money. And so one of the things that I've come to believe is that money will never give its life for you. Money doesn't care about you, but Jesus gave his life for you. Not so that you give all your money back to him, but so that you're free to trust him and trust in his provision and live in a place where you can now be generous with what God has given you. So I'm going to let Justin now lead us into a time of communion, and then I'm going to lead us into a time of prayer ministry after that, and prayer ministry and worship.